Welcome to Nyko's RPG. This is Game Master's Guide, where I help you as a game master make your games outstanding. So, in the past I've done a series of different events that try to focus on the creation of a world creation mechanism that will take about 80 days to develop, and so I call it the world in around 80 days. And before, I've always done it kind of happenstance, suggesting bits and pieces from it. But today, I'm going to be looking at the entire process as a single schedule, a single guideline, and we're going to walk through all of the 80 days in weekly pieces to kind of go over the basics. And so, well, let's get started. Before you do that, make sure you go down below and hit all the buttons so that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience, and let's go.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
All right, so if you're a game master like me, you are able to basically pick up a book, pick up a module, pick up a event guideline, and just run the story. And that's if what you are doing is running role-play games and that's what you want to do, that's fine. But I can tell you from 50 years of experience that from time to time you consider what links everything together, what is the glue, and what is the process of creating a singular worldview that all of your players can embrace. And so we're going to talk about a shortcut that I've kind of devised. It works out over roughly 10 weeks or so. And by working through all of the pieces in that sequence, you're able to create your event. Now, I'm just going to be doing a quick overview. I won't be going into any depth on each one of them, but I will be giving pointers on how each piece fits in with the ones before and after it. So let's look at the very beginning. All right, so when you're building a world, when you're building out a story, you have to have some idea of what kind of story you want to tell. If you are well read, you have quite an arsenal at your fingertips, and if not, I'll put the link to one of my episodes that I did in reference to the concept of deciding on which genre you want to cover. And genre can be as broad or as narrow as you want to cover, so I'm not going to go again into the particulars, but the idea of the genre will give a overall feel to the adventure. The theme will carry that deeper. And then, of course, the overall plot of the course that you wish to set for the players will be informed by these two choices. Now, when you're doing this, don't limit yourself. Don't say, I must only run gothic horror, or I must only run cosmic terror. You want to kind of get a feel for all of the possibilities. So I utilize a mechanism called Chainstorm. It's in one of my more recent books called The Way of the Game, and I'll put a link to that also in the comment section below, the description section. And then finally, the individual major threads that you want in your story. Not that you're going to lay it out definitively, but you're going to give a general idea of what a kind of course you expect to blaze this path through your adventure world. And by having all of these developed right off the get-go, it gives you a kind of a framework. The biggest danger when it comes to creating a new world is actually that you won't follow all of the angles, or you won't consider all of the possibilities. And so by doing it in this broad-based form early on, it gives you the opportunity to catch your missing pieces as you move through the episodes. And by holding to that line over time, you're able to build a more coherent story, which makes your adventure game more real for your players. And week 2, you're going to be looking at, in particular, the idea of building your story. And I recommend using something I've come to call the Matryoshka method. The idea is that you're going to take your story and determine the scale of the interactions you want to have in the story, from the very high-minded and broad spectrum of how do individuals get here metaphorically, all the way down to why do you like that person or dislike that person. And by developing these ideas from community, clan, class, and culture, you build out this accordion-like scale. And when the importance of this is when you're building a story and you're sharing information, you want to be able to link to the players at the point you want them to be. And by utilizing the scale, it lets you draw in definition very tightly on those pieces that you want to emphasize and push away or avoid going too deep in those areas that don't really matter to the story you're trying to tell. So by having a clear idea of how you want to approach each of these scales, you really get an idea of where the world is going. I do want to mention also that world building doesn't necessarily mean world building. It's really about story structure. If you are going to be telling a tale that does not approach the metaphoric, and you're not pursuing the idea of religion or anything, the idea of pursuing the real deep ends of cosmology are not going to be as important to you as, say, the relationship between individual characters and your characters with the world. And by focusing your depth to match what you're trying to accomplish, you make it much more likely that the players will be able to follow you when you move from level to level. Of course, the next is the individual story. And the individual story doesn't necessarily mean that you're mapping it out point by point by point. One of the biggest difficulties is that the very idea of creating a story to some people feel like it is a need to railroad or guide the players from your current position to your concluding position. But that's not necessarily the case. All you need to do is really consider, for the specifics of your story, the trajectory. Is it built out with the idea of the hero's progression, that you're moving through the hero's journey from rookie all the way to veteran? Or are you going to be using a different mechanism? Perhaps you're looking at it more along the idea of an anthology, where the individual stories are separated by time and location, but the theme of the results is really meant to tell the greater story. You also have to consider your time, your timing, your tempo, the rate at which things happen, because you want to determine whether you want the story to be broad and open and wide, or you're looking for a much more narrowed answer. This also means that you'll be developing specific key elements, what some call the beats of your adventure, so that you have an idea of what the process will be that the players will progress. It's really so that you're building out the pieces clear enough that they can see them, rather than it simply being something that occurs in the world that may or may not be noticed. This also means that you need to build out some story pieces that are perhaps teases or flaunts or whatever that draw the players off, the red herrings, only so that you can clearly know when those occur, because in your tempo of adventures, you want to keep that rhythmic beat going, and so a red herring should feel at least somewhat disjoint, so that the players can realize that they're perhaps following a different course, which ties back to the very idea of the congruence of the story, how uniform all the pieces fit together to make the structure understandable. Because when the players get where you're going, they're much more likely to be able to embrace that and make it part of their own story as well. Of course, the next thing we have to look at is how we're going to handle this concept of gaining focus and direction. Now, obviously, I use the term direction twice here, but the idea here is that you can be direct. You can have in your session 0 a clear understanding that you're wanting to move through this period of time in history, for example, if you're doing a historic adventure, or you're going to want to cover the progression of a certain condition or whatever. And by giving the players some idea of what you're wanting to do, they already have the basis for making that adventure travel that direction. The cues that you provide within the game will also help to inform this process. The idea of physical cues, happenstance, circumstance, and even veiled innuendo from NPCs they run into all help to give some body to the story that you're wanting to tell. You're giving some intensity, and then of course building in and embracing certain time pressures really provide your players with the opportunity to make the adventure make sense for them. Once we've gotten to this point, we have to look at the idea of a walkthrough. We need to be able to see metaphorically where we're going in the long term. Are we on process for that? Now, this doesn't mean that you're necessarily already running adventures. As a matter of fact, this could be happening in your pre-development phase because you're walking through yourself virtually the story and you're considering what your options might be so that the interaction between the players and the personas that you intend for them to engage with, the NPCs, if you will, and this gives you the opportunity to really change and focus the purpose for the engagement by having the interaction with the non-enjoined people, the NPCs, in a way that it makes sense for them. This fundamentally helps you to plug plot holes or perhaps discover where they might be and then decide whether you're going to utilize a red herring to divert them at that moment or are you going to focus on clearing up the plot holes. Now, it is important to recognize that the way the human mind works, we are much more involved with the idea of solving the puzzle than having a solved puzzle. So don't feel like these have to be completely patched up and made impervious, because the reality is that wouldn't happen. Instead, you want to build a way for the players to be able to thread the needle of your course and make the decisions that will be suitable for what you're trying to accomplish, but to give them the agency to make it their own, which means you have to test those threads, see whether or not they're strong enough and compelling enough to get the players to change courses. Now, this is a period of time also in your game that you want to start creating puzzles. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a physical puzzle. It doesn't mean it has to be a riddle or a rhyme. It just says that you're wanting to create the circles, the loops that are in your story so that your players will have something to chew on throughout the adventure because it's in their activity, their function within the game that you're going to be able to get what you're looking for out of the players during that session. Now, I mentioned session, and I am speaking in particular to role-play gamers and the idea of building a campaign world for them, but this also applies to your narratives for example, if you're going to write a novel, you're going to be looking at ways to, in this 6th week, we're going to be looking at particularly places where there might be challenges. And I'm using the term leak checks. I was in the military, and one of the things we always had to worry about was dealing with pressured lines, and you had to make sure that the lines were able to hold even when pressures changed and such. And so these leak checks means you're going to be looking at the how credible is the story? Is it believable from its face? If you're proposing a story that seems outlandish or unbelievable, you need to figure out the steps to get to that level of credibility. You want some way to hold the story to its course, and that means fundamentally plot stability. In other words, is the plot still supportable by the actions of the players in the game, the characters, the NPCs, and such? You want to set some hooks in the mechanism which will draw the players back to what your focus is. But at the same time, you need to inject some reality. That is, look at your non-enjoined persons, your NPCs, and figure out how they are functioning within the world and whether or not they are accomplishing their task and bringing the player along to their the course you are looking for. And at the same time, to build some depth. The idea of the story being a credible and believable one does demand that it also is a story that will fit within the thought process and time frame of the individuals in the story. Once you've done all of that, now we've got a pretty solid understanding of where our adventure is going. We need to now kind of build belief into the mechanism. That means think of the locales. And while we haven't yet talked about map building and such, in one of my first of the World in Around 80 Days segments, we did talk about how to build a virtual map. But the idea here is build out where your scenes are going to occur and how they flow together to maintain continuity, to maintain realism. If you are looking, for example, in an anthology, you could definitely pick up and move your campaign from location to location, but make sure that the coherency fits with the adventure itself. In other words, if you are working on a very high level cosmological constant kind of thing where you're dealing with the individual realities of the world in a metaphoric sense, make sure your second session will at least tie something back into that so that there is a flow through of the adventures. That means, for example, your non-player characters, the engagements need to be credible. So you can't, you're not going to want to set a situation up where the NPC's story is important to the adventurers, but their reason for being there and their connection with the story makes no sense. If you're developing your story at that point and you're not giving to the players a solid understanding of the environment they're in, and you're not really focusing on what they're doing, it's difficult for them to make justifications for the actions that you intend for them to do. When people talk about railroad and such things, generally what they're talking about is these points in the game where something is required of the players, but it doesn't feel like a player decision. And these are really the point of the justifications, is to establish a foundational reality that is understandable and acceptable so that the players will start to build belief in their purpose in being there, and therefore will take that ownership and really start to drive the adventure on their own. Okay, and the next one, this is one of my most fun parts of the system, is the population, and that is we need to build out all of the NEPs, all the NPCs that they're going to run into, whether we're talking about recurring PCs that are always there on the edge of the story, always available for them to interact with. They are really good in particular for helping with the story beats and to hold the rhythm of the adventure. Of course, you'll have to have your characters in the story that are the drivers, and whether these are focusing on the players or whether you're talking about the NPCs who are pushing the story forward, these mechanisms create the visceral reality of the story being held together by players and other characters who are hoping to accomplish whatever the task is. Now, that also means you need to look at simple elements of creativity, such as your mass multipliers. In other words, if you are going to be talking about a busy city, you need to fill a lot of empty boots, so to speak, so that the place feels like it's busy. This means working on creating the prototypes of your window dressings so that there are personas that fill the needs that players have to see that the place is busy. The wanderers by happenstance folk, what Dungeons and Dragons would call your classic NPCs that don't have any real importance to the story other than to be warm bodies as your players walk by so they feel the intensity of the community. But you also have to have a few fishwives. Now, this term may not be known and understood, but the idea here is that you need the persons that are going to drive your red herrings. And they can't feel in any real way different from your standard story drivers, or else your red herrings will fail. I can't tell you how many times I've run an adventure where I introduced an NPC and I didn't do it coherently, and the players were able to pick up on the fact that I given so much detail about the NPC that they no longer trusted them. And so you have to be it's a careful balance between true fishwives and the forced NPC that the players can see right through. And then, of course, ultimately you have your window dressing. If you think of the movie The Matrix, the woman in the red dress, everybody knows who I'm referring to. And the idea is you have to have one or two outstanding individuals that are only there for visual, only there for psychological itch scratching, so that it'll cause the players to turn and consider other possibilities. And by having credible window dressing, you really give the players a world to live in. All right, and then when we come down near the end, we have to also look at going back to our Matryoshka, our scaling, and look at each of the steps and how we're doing our transitions. So if you've got a world that has global intent, but the entire adventure has been done down at the street level, there's going to be a disconnect unless you found a way to flow the story so that they can see that their small piece of the puzzle fits perfectly into the collage that is the world that you've created. You need to find some ways to plug the holes that are too big or too dynamic. They're problematic, and this scale and focus on plugging holes really is talking about holes in the scale jump. So if you are building the story at the street level, but you do want to have one or two interactions at, say, the community level, you need to build in who those individuals are so that there is a fluid transition between levels. Fundamentally, this is the equivalent of stress testing an entity or a thing by giving it real examples and playing through it, at least in your mind, you're able to build out a much more solid story. And now we can start to enhance flavor. That is, if we have an engagement that seems a little flat, maybe we give some detail to that NPC, or perhaps we change the settings slightly so that it gives a deeper meaning to the players so they really get where you're trying to go. And then finally, you've got to have some mechanism for adjusting all of these elements. Until you got to the point where you have all of the elements, it's hard to figure out what controls will work. And when you're starting out as a new game master, it's hit or miss when you add, for example, the intensity of the local authorities. They need to be the same level of authority, whether it be a one-off situation, a happenstance, or whether it's a continued process that the players have developed. You need to find a way to add controls. Fundamentally, ways to add almost like gauges and switches to the story so that you can monitor and maintain the actual flow week over week. So now we're getting down to the point of taking the game live. And when you're to this point, you want to look at session 0 as your starting point. Yes, you're going to want to take information from your players and re-drive that back into the story you've already built. You're going to look at individual situations and perhaps run a dry run through, at least in your own situation, where you're able to gauge what the outcomes might be. You're going to want to integrate the story development that the players bring to the game, whether it's a fully developed backstory or whether, like as it is in the world of Nikos, a pigeon understanding of how that individual works with the world around him. And then, of course, in this process, you can start to determine by the player's actions which of the persona in the background will be able to be suitable for your villain. Perhaps he won't start out that way and the players will actually trust him, but at some point you may find that there is a really poignant reason why this individual should be on your list of bad guys. And it also means you'll be able to develop throughout this process conditions that you will be able to use as your gauges, almost in a metaphoric way, almost like the bells and buzzers behind the scenes that let you bring the game to a reality and make it all make sense. Alrighty, so now that we've built out the storyline of the 10 weeks to build a world, thereabouts, the around 80 days, could be longer, could be shorter, we never know. But the question I have for you is, what world would you create? What would be your starting point? Let's go with the idea of looking at this viewpoint, this process, and which of these elements would be the most fun to you and which of them would be your greatest sticking points. From my experience, I can tell you that there are times throughout my career that each of these stages has been the critical, essential one, and other times that one falls out of the favor and becomes much more important. Like the idea right now of building non-enjoying players is fairly routine and rudimentary for me, so I don't focus on that, but instead I'm working on building out better understanding of my staging process so that the game feels more dynamic, because right now it's kind of start stop, kind of jerky in the way it's operating, and that to me tells me that it's a matter of flow and control, and I need to revise those. But tell me what your take is. I'd love to have that conversation. And in the meantime, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next episode. Remember that we record at least once a day, 5 days a week. And if this is the kind of stuff you like, let me know, and I will see you in the next episode. So let's go play.